Article 36, Player Agents. Now, this is a consolidated version of the NBPA's regulations governing player agents, and you can find that audiobook in the playlist, the CBA playlist on the channel. And I'm just going to go over a few things that are necessary and are pretty self-explanatory if you've already gone over those regulations. Section 1, Approval of Player Contracts. The NBA shall not approve any player contract unless that player is represented by an agent certified by the Players Association or acts on his own behalf in negotiating that contract. Section 2, Fines. A fine of $50,000 is going to be imposed on any team that negotiates with an agent or rep that's not certified. Section 3, Prohibition on players as agents. Players are prohibited from representing other current or prospective NBA players as an agent or holding an equity interest or position in a business that represents other current or prospective NBA players as an agent. Section 5, Agent Lists. These lists will be updated once every 2 weeks from the day after the NBA Finals to the first day of the next succeeding regular season and will be updated once a month at all other times. And this list is just going to have the name of the player agents, all certified, and the players which they represent. Article 37, Player Appearances in Uniform. Section 1, Player Appearances. A player may be required to make up to 2 appearances at the request of the NBA, and he'll be paid at least $3,500 for appearances. When he fails to appear, he can be fined for each failure in an amount up to $20,000. Section 2, Uniform. During any NBA game or practice, including warm-ups, and going to and from the locker room, the player must wear only the uniform, not including sneakers, worn by a player during an NBA game or practice. A player may not, during an NBA game, display any commercial, promotional, or charitable name, mark, logo, or other identification, including but not limited to, on his body, in his hair, or otherwise. Article 39, Term of Agreement. Section 1, Effective Date and Expiration Date. This agreement will be effective from July 1, 2017, and unless otherwise terminated, will continue in full force and effect through June 30, 2024. Section 2, Mutual Options to Terminate Following 6th Season. The NBA and Players Association will have the option to terminate this agreement on June 30, 2023 by serving written notice on or before December 15, 2022 to the other party. Section 4, Termination by NBA/National TV Revenues. Now, quote, national TV revenues will mean the rights, fees, or other non-contingent payments stated in the NBA's third-party national broadcast network and cable network television agreements. And, quote, other media income will mean the aggregate net income earned by any league-related entity on behalf of the teams that provide for the transmission of live or delayed NBA games on a domestic or international basis. If, during the term of this agreement, the sum of the average of annual national TV revenues under the successor agreements plus 104.5% of other media income for the most recent cap year will be at least 35% less than the sum of the average national TV revenues plus other media income for 2016-2017 cap year, the NBA will have the right to terminate this agreement effective as of the June 30, immediately preceding the first season covered by the successor agreements. Section 5, Termination by NBA and Force Majeure. A, quote, force majeure event shall mean the occurrence of any of the following events, provided that that event or condition either makes it impossible for the NBA to perform its obligations or frustrates the underlying purpose of the agreement or makes it economically impracticable for the NBA to perform its obligations. And a force majeure, an example is a biological warfare or chemical warfare, terrorism, or the actual pandemic that we just experienced in 2020 is a great example of what could be a force majeure reasoning, a reason to terminate the contract. But the NBA actually worked through it. Now, if a force majeure event occurs and as a result, one or more teams are unable to play one or more games, then for each missed game during the force majeure period that was not rescheduled and replayed, the compensation payable to each player will be reduced by 192.6 of the player's compensation for the seasons covered by the force majeure period. For the purposes of the foregoing calculation, each team will be deemed to play 5 exhibition games, 82 regular season games, and 5.6 playoff games during each such season. The applicable compensation reduction from each player will be withheld by the player's team from the first compensation payment due to the player following the commencement of the force majeure period. If that compensation or payments are insufficient to cover the compensation reduction, then either the player will promptly pay the difference directly to the team, or if he subsequently enters into a player contract with or is traded to another team, then the difference will be withheld from the first available compensation payment. Now, upon the occurrence of a force majeure event, the NBA will have the right to terminate this agreement as of the 60th day following the delivery to the Players Association of that written notice of termination. Section 6, Mutual Right of Termination. If any provision contained in Articles 7, 10, 11, or 14 is enjoined, vacated, declared null and void, or is rendered unenforceable by any court of competent jurisdiction, then either the NBA or the Players Association has the right to terminate this agreement upon serving papers, the written notice of termination, at least 60 days prior to the effective date of that termination to the other party. Article 40, Expansion and Contraction. Section 2, Contraction. If the NBA decides to contract the number of teams, then the NBA will provide written notice of that decision to the Players Association, and the NBA and the Players Association will negotiate and agree upon the effects of that decision. Article 41, NBA Development League, which is now called the G League. Section 1, G League Work Assignments. An NBA team may at any time assign a player other than a two-way player on its active list or inactive list to a G League team, provided that the player has either 0, 1, or 2 years of service, or has more than 2 years of service, and the player and the Players Association consent to that assignment in writing. Now, upon the G League work assignment, the quote G League work assignment, the player will be placed on the NBA team's inactive list and shall report to the G League team, and at the direction of the NBA team, subsequently return and report to and resume the performance of services for the NBA team. Now, a G League work assignment commences when the player reports in person and ends either when the player, upon being recalled, reports back to his NBA team, or when the G League season ends. There is no limit on the number of G League work assignments given to a player, and no NBA team will issue a G League work assignment for the purpose of disciplining a player for misconduct or retaliation against a player. Section 2, Reporting Requirements for G League Work Assignments. In order to initiate a G League work assignment or terminate that assignment and recall the player, the NBA team will provide the player, the NBA, and the Players Association with written notice, and the player will report within 48 hours of that notice. If the player, without a reasonable excuse, does not report, then he could be fined and or suspended without pay by the NBA team until he actually reports. And in addition, it will constitute conduct prejudicial to the NBA under Article 35D of the NBA Constitution, and subject, however, to the one penalty requirement set forth in Article 6, Section 10. Section 3, Travel and Relocation Expenses. A player's NBA team will be obligated to reimburse the player for his ordinary and reasonable expenses incurred in traveling to and when recalled from the G League team. This is, quote, the G League two-way service, and relocating to and if recalled from the G League team's home location that extends beyond a period of 30 days. The player will be provided with housing or a housing subsidy in accordance with the G League housing policy. Section 4, Team and G League Work Assignment and G League Two-Way Service. General terms. During or in connection with any G League Work Assignment or G League Two-Way Service, a player will accept and be subject to the work requirements, as such requirements and conditions may change from time to time, and continue to be subject to the terms and obligations and entitled to the benefits and rights, including without limitation years of service and free agency rights, of his uniform player contract in this agreement. Compensation and benefits. The player's performance in the G League will not be considered for purposes of any incentive compensation contained in his uniform player contract. An injury sustained while participating in basketball practice or a game for the G League will be deemed an injury sustained while participating in a basketball practice or game for the NBA team. During or in connection with any G League work assignment, a player will continue to be eligible to receive the benefits set forth in Article 4, and shall not accept any benefits from the G League or G League team unless expressly set forth in this Article 41. Meal expense. While on the road with his G League team, a player shall receive the meal expense allowance applicable to the NBA players and will not receive or accept any meal expense or per diem from the G League or any G League team. The player will also providing G League two-way service will receive the meal expense allowance applicable to G League players. Travel accommodations. During a G League work assignment or G League two-way service, the player will be provided with the same travel accommodations that are provided to the G League players, except that a player on a G League work assignment will not be required to share a hotel room and will be permitted to fly first class when traveling to road games when first class seats are available on that G League team's flight. Conduct and discipline. The player's G League team, the NBA, and the player's NBA team may impose a fine and or suspension on the player for the violation of G League or G League team rules. Any disciplinary action taken by the NBA or an NBA team will supersede disciplinary action taken by the G League or the G League team. Furthermore, the one penalty rule set forth in Articles 6, Section 10 of the agreement shall apply. When it comes to off-court conduct that is prohibited, NBA rules shall apply. When a player on a G League work assignment is suspended by his team, then his base compensation for the year of the contract during which the suspension occurred will be reduced by 1/145th of the player's base comp for each missed G League game for any suspension of less than 20 games, and by 1/110th of the base comp for each missed G League game in excess of 20 games, including any indefinite suspension of a player that persists for 20 games or more, or consecutive suspensions for continuing acts. Now, the player must remain on the NBA inactive list during the term of the suspension, but may be recalled at the option of the team, provided the player may not play in NBA games during the term of the suspension. When a two-way player is suspended, the following shall apply. If the two-way player was on the two-way list, then his base comp will be reduced by 1/88th of the player's two-way G League salary for any suspension of less than 12 games and 1/167th for 12 games or more. This is the, quote, G League reduction rate for each missed G League game, and the player must be maintained on the team's two-way list for the full term of the suspension. Now, if the two-way player was on the active list, then his base compensation will be reduced by 145th of the player's two-way NBA salary for a suspension less than 20 games, and 110th of the player's two-way NBA salary for any suspension of 20 games or more. This is, quote, the NBA reduction rate for each missed NBA game, and the player will be maintained on the team's active list during the full term of the suspension, except if the suspension is more than 5 games, in which case the player will be transferred to the team's two-way list following the 5th game of the suspension, at which point he would begin to accrue his two-way G League salary, and his base compensation will be reduced at the G League reduction rate for each missed NBA game. If the two-way player was on the inactive list, then the player will be transferred to the two-way list during the full term of the suspension, and the player's base comp will be reduced by the G League reduction rate for every missed NBA game. If the player was on the active or inactive list, the player will be placed on the two-way list for all or part of the suspension, and his base comp will be reduced by the NBA reduction rate for each missed NBA game while the two-way player is on the active or inactive list, and by the G League reduction rate for each missed NBA game while the two-way player is on the two-way list. A fine or suspension imposed by the G League or G League team via the player's G League work assignment or two-way service may be heard and resolved by a grievance arbitrator only if it would result in financial impact to the player of more than $5,000. Medical treatment and physical condition. The G League and/or G League team may make public medical information about a player on a G League work assignment or G League two-way service. Promotional activities. Any promotional appearances that the player is required to make during G League work assignment or G League two-way service will count against the appearances the player is obligated to provide to the NBA and his NBA team, provided that player will be required to provide 2 additional promotional appearances while on G League work assignment or G League two-way service each season to the G League or his G League team. Section 5, Miscellaneous. A player will not directly or indirectly own or hold interest in the G League or any G League team unless authorized by the NBA. At the conclusion of each season covered by the agreement, the NBA and Players Association will meet to discuss issues concerning the operation of this Article 41. That concludes Articles 36 to 41, pages 461 to 481, covering player agents, player appearances in uniform, terms of agreement, and NBA G League. Happy studying. See you at the top.